It was late autumn, and the ground was covered with frost, with thick fog blanketing a small village in the countryside of Yorkshire. Emma had inherited an old farm from her great-grandfather, which had stood abandoned for years. Looking for a fresh start, she moved there from Manchester, planning to restore the place and build a new life. Locals often whispered about the farm, saying it was cursed or unsettled, but Emma dismissed these stories as mere superstition. The farm was in rough shape. Peeling paint on the house, a broken fence, and half-collapsed barns. Determined, Emma decided to spend her first night in the house, even though it barely seemed habitable. The walls were damp. Spiders crawled in the corners, and she could hear mice scurrying in the attic. It felt as if the house had its own presence in the middle of the night. She woke to strange noises outside. A footstep slow and deliberate echoed across the yard. Peeking through the window, she saw nothing but the dense fog curling around the property. "It's just the wind," she told herself, trying to push away her unease. But the sound of the footsteps lingered. The next morning, Emma inspected the grounds and found strange footprints in the mud leading from the nearby woods to the old well. The prints resembled human ones but were unnaturally large, with oddly elongated toes. Trying to stay rational, she chalked it up to a prank by local teenagers. Each night that followed brought more disturbances. Whispers seemed to drift through the house. Even when she was alone one evening, while clearing out the barn, Emma discovered an old, dust-covered journal belonging to her great-grandfather. Inside, he had documented strange occurrences on the farm. Livestock disappearing, eerie voices from the woods, and vivid nightmares of shadowy figures. One day, while making her rounds, Emma noticed that the sheep she had recently purchased had vanished. Searching the property, she found remnants near the old well. The stone walls of the well bore deep scratches, as if something had been clawing to climb out. The fog around the farm seemed heavier with each passing day, and the whispers grew louder. One night, while sitting by the fireplace, the lights in the house began to flicker. The front door creaked open, despite being locked. Emma froze, heart pounding, as a tall, shadowy figure with unnaturally long limbs and glowing eyes stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fog. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, only stared at her with those piercing eyes. One morning, neighbors came to check on Emma after she hadn't answered her phone. They found the house in disarray, with broken windows and splintered doors. Emma was discovered by the well, standing motionless and mumbling incoherently. She disappeared shortly after that day. The farm remains abandoned, shrouded in mystery. Locals steer clear of it, and on foggy nights, faint whispers can still be heard coming from the woods, sending chills down the spines of anyone who dares to listen. 2 years passed, and the farm's eerie reputation continued to grow. Tom, a journalist for a local paper, decided to investigate the farm after hearing rumors of Emma's disappearance. He was skeptical of the supernatural stories and believed there had to be a rational explanation. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, he drove out to the property on a cold November evening. The air was still, and the fog hung low as Tom approached the gate. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. He pushed open the creaking gate and stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the house. The farm looked even more decrepit than the photos he had. scene, with ivy crawling up the walls and windows boarded up. Tom decided to start with the well. As he approached, he noticed something peculiar. The ground around it was damp, despite the lack of recent rain. The stone walls of the well seemed darker, almost as if they were wet to the touch. Peering inside with his flashlight, he saw nothing but darkness. However, the air that rose from the well was unnaturally cold, carrying a faint, acrid smell. Inside the house, the atmosphere was stifling. Dust covered every surface, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. As Tom walked through the rooms, he found remnants of Emma's life. Her coat still hanging on a chair, a mug left on the counter, and a partially packed suitcase near the stairs. It was as if she had left in a hurry to end the living room. Tom found the journal Emma had discovered. Flipping through its pages, he noticed entries that hadn't been there before, written in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. The entries described visions of a figure standing at the foot of the bed, whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls, and a compulsion to return to the well. Suddenly, a low thud echoed through the house. Tom froze, his flashlight beam darting to the source of the sound. It came from upstairs. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the creaking staircase, the steps groaning under his weight. At the top, he found a small room with a single chair facing the window. On the chair lay a photograph of Emma, but her face had been scratched out. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Tom felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers began. Faint at first, but growing louder. They seemed to be coming from the walls, surrounding him. Dropping the photograph, he bolted down the stairs and out of the house, not daring to look back. Despite his initial fear, Tom couldn't let the mystery go. A week later, he returned with a team. Sarah, a local historian who had researched the property's past, and Alex, a tech expert who specialized in paranormal investigations but approached them with scientific skepticism. The three set up cameras and audio recorders throughout the house and around the well. Sarah uncovered old land records and shared them as they worked. The farm dates back to the late 1800s. There were reports of strange disappearances, even then livestock, workers, even children. And look at this. She showed them a faded map of the area, marking a series of abandoned wells. It's not just this one, the locals used to call them the Devil's Throat. Alex scoffed, adjusting a motion sensor near the barn. Folklore always exaggerates. Most likely, the ground shifted and the wells became unstable. Accidents turned into ghost stories. That night, as the team gathered in the living room to monitor the equipment, the motion sensor near the well triggered. The camera feed showed nothing unusual, just the fog swirling unnaturally close. But then, faintly, they heard it, whispers, too low to make out, growing louder as the fog thickened. "Is that the wind?" Tom asked, his voice tight. Sarah shook her head, her eyes fixed on the screen. "No, it's something else." Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the power flickered. Alex's equipment went haywire, emitting static and beeping erratically. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the house. The team froze as the front door creaked open. "Stay together," Tom whispered, grabbing a flashlight. They cautiously moved toward the door, but before they could reach it, the whispers converged into a single, chilling word. "Leave." Panic set in, and they ran to the car, abandoning their equipment. As they sped away, Sarah glanced back. Through the rear window, she swore she saw a figure standing by the well. Its glowing eyes piercing through the fog. The footage and recordings retrieved later were inconclusive. The cameras captured the fog thickening unnaturally, but no definitive figures. The whispers, however, were clear and unsettling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The farm remains untouched, a haunting enigma for those brave or foolish enough to investigate. It was a quiet summer evening when Sam and Laura moved into their newly acquired farm in the outskirts of Oregon. They had been dreaming of escaping the chaos of city life, trading honking horns and crowded streets for open skies and the scent of fresh hay. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Thornton, had sold it at a surprisingly low price, claiming he was too old to maintain it anymore. The couple thought they had hit the jackpot. The property was sprawling, with a farmhouse that had a rustic charm, a barn that seemed to have stood the test of time, and acres of fertile land. Sam was particularly excited about the prospect of starting a small vineyard, while Laura looked forward to keeping chickens and growing her own vegetables. It was a fresh start, and the possibilities seemed endless. However, as they began unpacking, they noticed peculiar details about the house. The attic door was nailed shut with multiple planks of wood, and there were strange symbols carved into the wooden beams in the basement. Laura dismissed them as quirks of the house's age, but Sam couldn't shake off the unease they brought. One evening, while clearing out the barn, Sam discovered an old journal tucked away in a rusted toolbox. The leather cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with time. The entries were written by a man named Edward Hale, who appeared to have owned the farm in the early 1900s. The initial entries were mundane, detailing crop yields and livestock care. But as Sam read on, the tone of the journal shifted. Edward wrote about a strange phenomenon that began occurring on the farm. Livestock started disappearing without a trace, and strange noises echoed through the fields at night. He described seeing shadows darting between the trees and feeling as though he was being watched. The final entry was cryptic. "Whatever it is, it does not belong here. I have tried to keep it contained, but I fear it is growing stronger." Sam shared the journal with Laura, who was skeptical but intrigued. They decided to focus on fixing up the house and let the eerie details of the past remain just that, details of the past. But that night, they were awakened by the sound of their chickens squawking in distress. Rushing outside with a flashlight, they found the coop empty, the door ripped off its hinges. There were no feathers, no tracks, just silence. The following weeks were tense. Laura insisted on installing motion-activated cameras around the property, while Sam doubled down on fortifying the barn and chicken coop. Despite their precautions, the strange occurrences continued. Tools went missing, lights flickered unpredictably, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The footage from the cameras showed nothing unusual, just the stillness of the fields under the moonlight. One night, as they sat by the fireplace trying to distract themselves with an old movie, the power suddenly went out. Sam grabbed a flashlight and headed to the circuit breaker outside, while Laura stayed inside to keep an eye on their dog, Max. Moments later, Max began growling at the door, his fur standing on end. Laura froze as she heard faint, deliberate knocks. "Sam?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no response. She peered through the peephole but saw only darkness. Suddenly, Sam burst through the back door, his face pale. "The breaker, it's fine," he stammered. "But I saw something. A figure out by the barn." The couple spent the rest of the night huddled together, armed with a baseball bat and a kitchen knife. By dawn, they decided they couldn't handle the situation alone. Sam contacted a local historian, hoping to learn more about the farm's history, while Laura reached out to a wildlife expert to explain the disappearances of their animals. The historian, an elderly woman named Margaret, arrived later that week with a stack of documents. She revealed that the land the farm was built on had once been a site for local rituals, long before settlers arrived. "Some believe the land carries remnants of those times," she said carefully. "But most of these stories are just folklore." The wildlife expert, on the other hand, found no evidence of common predators like coyotes or wolves. "Whatever took your livestock," he concluded, "it wasn't anything natural." As the days turned into weeks, Sam and Laura became more determined to uncover the truth. But the deeper they dug, the more the farm seemed to resist their presence. Objects moved on their own, whispers echoed in empty rooms, and the barn, their once beloved barn, became a place they refused to enter after dark. One evening, as they reviewed the old journal once more, they noticed something they had missed. A map had been drawn on the last page, marking a spot deep in the woods behind the farm. Armed with flashlights and a sense of desperation, they decided to investigate the next day, hoping to put an end to the growing mystery once and for all. The next morning, with the fog still clinging to the ground and the sun barely peeking over the horizon, Sam and Laura set out into the woods behind the farm. They followed the map, which was surprisingly detailed, leading them down a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into the thick underbrush. The trees stood tall and silent, their gnarled branches casting long, twisted shadows that made the air feel even heavier. As they ventured deeper, the sounds of the farm faded away, replaced by the constant rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence seemed. No birds chirped, no animals scurried through the undergrowth, just an eerie stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a clearing. In the center, half buried under a blanket of ivy and moss, was an old stone structure, its purpose unclear, but its presence undeniable. The stones were weathered, and strange symbols were carved into them, similar to those they had found in the basement of the farmhouse. The air felt heavier here, charged with an ancient energy that made Laura's skin crawl. "Is this it?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He pointed to the center of the structure, where a small altar-like stone sat, partially obscured by vines. Laura nodded, her heart racing. She approached the stone cautiously, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. There was something unsettling about the place, as if it were waiting for something or someone. "This has to be the spot," she said, crouching down to examine the altar. As she reached out to touch the stone, a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but soon grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Sam jumped back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice laced with panic. Laura nodded, but her hand remained steady on the stone. "We need to find out what this is. What it means." Before Sam could respond, a soft, distant sound broke the tension, a low, guttural growl. It seemed to come from the trees, but there was no animal to be seen. The sound grew louder, closer, and suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. Without warning, the vines around the altar began to twist and shift as if alive. Sam and Laura jumped back in shock as the symbols on the stone began to glow faintly, their edges illuminating with a dim, ghostly light. The growl grew into a series of unsettling whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once, drowning out everything else. The atmosphere turned suffocating. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, pressing in on them, forcing them to confront something they weren't prepared to face. Laura stumbled back, her breath quickening, but Sam's eyes were fixed on the altar. "Sam, we need to go now," Laura urged, her voice panicked, but Sam remained rooted to the spot. "I think we've found it. We've found whatever's been haunting this place," he said, his voice distant, as if he were no longer fully there. Suddenly, a shape emerged from the darkness of the trees, a figure cloaked in shadows, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the gloom. Sam's body stiffened, his hand reaching out as if in a trance. "Sam, no!" Laura screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him back toward the trail. But Sam didn't budge. The figure took a step forward, its form solidifying in the dim light. It was tall, too tall for a normal person, and its features were obscured by a shifting, shadowy haze that seemed to distort reality itself. The whispers were louder now, converging on Sam and Laura from all directions. "Get away from him!" Laura shouted, fear rising in her chest. She could feel the cold, unnatural presence of the figure, and it made her blood run cold. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it extended its long, bony hand toward Sam. Laura felt a sharp, icy tug on her chest, as though the very air around her was being sucked away. It was as if the forest, the land, and even the very sky were complicit in whatever was happening. Sam blinked, his eyes shifting back to normal. He looked at Laura, confusion flooding his expression. What's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. Before Laura could answer, the ground beneath them began to shake violently, and the whispers turned into an unbearable screech. The figure's form distorted, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to collapse in on itself. Without thinking, Laura grabbed Sam's hand and pulled him toward the trail. They ran, stumbling through the woods, the shrieking whispers following them every step of the way. The earth seemed to groan beneath their feet, and branches whipped at their faces, as if the forest itself was trying to keep them from escaping. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, they looked back. The clearing was gone. The stone structure, the altar, the figure, they had all vanished as if they had never existed. Shaking and exhausted, they made their way back to the farmhouse in silence, their minds reeling from what they had just experienced. They didn't know what they had uncovered, but one thing was clear: whatever it was still here, still waiting. The farm, the land, it had never truly let go of its dark history. The mystery of the farm was far from over. It had only just begun. The days that followed felt like a blur for Sam and Laura. Despite their best efforts to return to normal life on the farm, the unease never left them. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees, sent their hearts racing. The figure, the altar, the strange sensations, they lingered in their minds, taunting them. Sam had tried to call the local authorities, but they were dismissive, offering only vague assurances that wild animals could explain the disappearances. They never seemed to take their story seriously. Even Margaret, the historian, seemed unervingly silent when they shared their experience. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the land demands a price. But I can't help you with that." The unease grew into something far worse. The feeling of being watched became a constant companion, gnawing at them from every corner of the farmhouse. Max, their dog, who had been the one to first growl at the figure in the woods, refused to go near the barn. It was as if he knew something they didn't, something they were afraid to acknowledge. One night, after days of restless sleep, Laura finally confronted Sam. "We have to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "This place. It's not just haunted. It's alive. It's trying to pull us in, and it won't stop until we're part of it." Sam didn't respond immediately. He stood by the window, staring out at the fog creeping along the edges of the field, as it often did at night. He knew Laura was right. He felt it, too, the growing pull of the land, the creeping sense that they weren't in control anymore. But something inside him, an old, stubborn part, refused to give in. They had come here for a fresh start, for peace, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to abandon it yet. But the next morning, as they sat in silence over breakfast, something changed. The fog that had been so familiar, so persistent, was thicker than usual. It crept closer, blanketing the farmhouse in an unnatural stillness. As Sam opened the door to check on the property, he froze. Standing at the edge of the property line was a figure, a shadow, taller than any man should be, standing motionless, its red eyes gleaming through the mist. Sam slammed the door shut, his heart pounding. "Laura," he gasped. "It's here. It's here again." They didn't speak for a long moment, both of them realizing what needed to be done. That evening, they packed their things. They didn't care about the vineyard or the chickens or the farm anymore. They needed to leave. They needed to get away from the land that had started to claim them, piece by piece. As they drove away from the farm, they looked back one last time. The fog hung heavy over the property, and in the distance, Sam thought he saw the figure standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, watching them leave. The road ahead seemed endless, but as the farm grew smaller in the rearview mirror, the weight on their chests lightened. They didn't know where they would go next, only that they couldn't stay. As the miles passed, and the haunting whispers of the land faded into the distance, Sam and Laura both knew something they couldn't deny. The farm wasn't just a place. It was a curse, and it would always follow them, no matter how far they ran. The land had marked them, and the darkness that lived there would never truly let them go. The whispers would remain, waiting for their return. It was a cool autumn day when Adam and Emily found themselves standing outside the gates of the old farm they had inherited from a distant relative. They had never met the person who left them the property, but when they received the letter informing them of the inheritance, it seemed like an opportunity too good to pass up. Both of them had always dreamed of moving to the countryside, away from the noise of the city, and starting fresh. The farm, though run down and forgotten, was their ticket to a new life. The land was vast, with fields stretching far beyond the horizon, dotted with old apple trees and overgrown patches of grass. The farmhouse, although dilapidated, had an undeniable charm, with ivy crawling up the brick walls and a large wooden porch that wrapped around the front. The barn was even older, with peeling paint and rusted tools scattered around the yard, yet there was a strange beauty in its decay, and Adam could already picture the life they could build here. They wasted no time getting started. Adam was determined to restore the barn and turn part of the land into a small organic farm, while Emily dreamed of transforming the house into a cozy bed and breakfast. They worked tirelessly, cleaning, repairing, and planting, all the while growing closer to each other and to the land. There was something deeply satisfying about the simplicity of the life they were beginning to carve out for themselves. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. It started with the odd noises at night. At first, they thought it was the wind or the house settling, but the sounds grew increasingly distinct: footsteps, whispers, a distant humming. Adam tried to brush it off, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. One evening, she even saw a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the woods. When she blinked, the figure was gone. She told Adam, but he didn't believe her, attributing it to the shadows of the trees and her tired eyes. Then came the animals. Their chickens began to act strangely. Every morning, the coop was found empty, though the door was locked. The only trace left behind was a single feather, always in the same spot. They tried everything reinforcing the coop, adding more security, but nothing worked. The chickens continued to disappear without a trace. And it wasn't just the chickens. Adam noticed that the rabbits they had kept in a small pen also began vanishing, as though they were being drawn away by some unseen force. One night, as they sat by the fire, Emily confided in Adam about something that had been on her mind for days. "I think the land doesn't want us here," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like something's wrong. Something's alive." Adam laughed, trying to reassure her. "It's just your imagination running wild. You've been working hard, Emily. Maybe you need some rest." But deep down, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as well. He had started having dreams, strange, vivid dreams of a woman standing in the middle of the farm, her long, dark hair blowing in the wind. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. In these dreams, the woman would beckon him toward the woods, but when he tried to follow, he would always wake up before he could reach her. One evening, as they ventured out to the barn to gather some supplies, they found a strange symbol carved into the doorframe. It was an intricate design, unlike anything they had ever seen, and it seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. They tried to ignore it, but Emily felt an icy chill run down her spine. There was something ancient about that symbol, something that felt as though it had been there long before they arrived. The following day, they decided to investigate the land more thoroughly. Armed with nothing more than a map of the property, they set off on foot, hoping to uncover the mystery of the strange occurrences. As they walked deeper into the woods behind the farm, they stumbled upon something they hadn't expected: a hidden cemetery. The gravestones were old and weathered, their names barely legible, and in the center of the clearing stood a large, stone monument. Emily felt a wave of unease wash over her as they approached the monument. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. "I don't like this," she whispered. "We should go back." But Adam was drawn to the stone. He could feel the weight of the history surrounding it, as though the land itself was trying to tell him something. As he reached out to touch the monument, he felt a sudden jolt of energy surge through him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw flashes of the past, people, faces, movements from another time, all rushing toward him. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Adam staggered back, his heart racing. "Did you feel that?" he asked, but Emily was already backing away, her face pale. "We need to leave," she insisted. "Now." They hurried back to the farmhouse, but the sense of foreboding only grew stronger. That night, they barricaded themselves inside, the feeling of being watched more intense than ever before. The strange symbols on the barn, the disappearing animals, the unsettling dreams, they all seemed connected. As though they had stumbled upon something much older and darker than they had ever imagined. The next morning, they found the door to the barn wide open, and inside, every tool and piece of equipment had been carefully arranged into an intricate pattern on the floor. At the center of the pattern was a new symbol, one that hadn't been there before. It was a warning, Adam realized, a warning they had ignored for too long. With no other choice, Adam and Emily packed their things and left the farm behind, unsure of what they had unleashed or whether it would ever truly let them go. The land, it seemed, had a life of its own, and it would not easily release those who dared to disturb its ancient peace. As they drove away, they looked back one last time. The farmhouse stood silent in the distance, but in the woods, just beyond the trees, they swore they saw the woman from Adam's dreams, watching them leave. And as they drove on, the haunting feeling that they had never truly left the farm lingered, echoing in their minds like a distant whisper on the wind. Adam and Emily left the farm behind with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The drive back to the city was long, and the roads felt unfamiliar without the sense of familiarity they had started to build at the farm. They didn't talk much during the drive. The silence between them felt heavy, as though they were both processing the same unsettling thoughts, but neither wanted to be the first to voice them. When they finally arrived back in the city, it felt like a different world. The noise, the hustle and bustle, everything that had once felt overwhelming now seemed almost comforting. Yet, despite the city's chaos, there was no escaping the feeling that something was still watching them. Every creak of the floorboards in their apartment, every knock on the door, set their nerves on edge. Adam tried to focus on work, throwing himself into his job as a freelance photographer, hoping that the normalcy of his routine would help him forget. But it didn't work. He couldn't shake the feeling that the farm wasn't just behind them, it was still with them, somewhere in the shadows. Emily, too, found it hard to return to her previous life. She had started counseling clients again, but her once vibrant energy had dulled. It wasn't just the unease they'd experienced on the farm, it was something deeper, an unshakable connection to the place, to the land, that she couldn't explain. It wasn't long before they started having dreams separate, but identical. They both dreamed of the stone monument in the woods, the coldness of the cemetery, the feeling of being drawn to it. In the dreams, the woman with the dark hair and piercing eyes was always there, beckoning them, her silent gaze filled with warning. One evening, nearly a month after leaving, Adam received a strange package at their apartment. It was a small, weathered book, with no return address and no note attached. When he opened it, he was stunned to find it was the journal of Edward Hale, the same man whose writings they had discovered on the farm. The handwriting, though more faded and fragile, was unmistakable. The journal's final entry was unsettling, almost prophetic in its tone. The land is never truly forgotten. It will call to you, and when it does, you must answer. The hairs on the back of Adam's neck stood up as he read those words. He turned to Emily, who had been sitting quietly across the room. She looked at him, her face pale, as though she had known what he was about to say. "We have to go back," he whispered. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't say anything, but her eyes held a strange determination. It was as though something within her, some primal instinct, was telling her that their unfinished business at the farm needed to be dealt with. They didn't speak of the decision for the rest of the evening. There was a quiet understanding between them, a mutual recognition that there was no other choice. It wasn't just about the farm anymore, it was about the pull of the land, the darkness that had followed them. They both knew, deep down, that their return was inevitable. The following day, they packed their things once again, but this time, the feeling of dread was more intense. They left the city early in the morning, the sky still dark with the remnants of the night. The drive felt longer this time, the silence between them heavier than before. When they finally reached the farm, the first thing they noticed was how much had changed. The land seemed to have swallowed the house, the barn, and the fields in a way that didn't feel natural. The air was thicker, heavier, as if the farm itself was holding its breath, waiting. The farmhouse looked just as it had before, but the sense of familiarity was gone. It felt like a place they no longer belonged. The barn was more foreboding, its doors standing ajar as though inviting them in. They didn't waste any time. With a journal in hand, they ventured out into the woods. The path was clearer now, and as they made their way deeper into the trees, the unease grew stronger. The sounds of the forest seemed muted, as though they were walking through a dream. When they finally reached the cemetery, it was just as they remembered. But now, the stone monument stood taller, darker, its surface etched with something they hadn't noticed before, symbols, similar to the ones they had seen on the barn. As Adam stepped closer to the monument, he felt the air grow colder. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and the trees whispered with a strange, mournful sound. Then, as if in answer to some silent call, the woman appeared. She was not the same figure from their dreams. This woman was more solid, more real. Her face was familiar, but distorted, as if caught between a memory and a nightmare. She stood before them, her eyes dark and knowing, her mouth slightly open, as though she had been waiting for them to return. "We should never have left," she said, her voice like a distant echo. "The land will never let you go. It remembers." In that moment, Adam and Emily realized that the farm wasn't just haunted by ghosts, it was alive in a way they hadn't understood before. And no matter where they went, it would always follow them, its roots too deep to escape. They had come back to face the darkness and to face the truth of their connection to the land. As the woman disappeared into the mist, they understood that their lives had been changed forever. The land was their home now, for better or for worse. And it would always be waiting for them to return. Adam and Emily stood in the graveyard, the cold wind swirling around them, carrying with it an unsettling stillness. The woman who had appeared to them was gone, but her presence lingered like a heavy fog. It was as if the air itself had thickened, and with every breath, they felt the weight of the land pressing down on them, pulling them deeper into its grip. "I don't understand," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the stone monument. "What does she mean?" "It remembers." Adam didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the graves, the worn names etched into the stones. He felt a strange connection to this place now, something he couldn't explain. The feeling of being watched, of being drawn to the land, was stronger than ever. "We need to find out more," Adam finally said, his voice low but determined. "There's something here, something we haven't figured out yet. This isn't just about the farm, it's about the land itself." They made their way back to the farmhouse, their steps slow and deliberate. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should, every crack in the wooden floorboards echoing in the silence of the house. The barn, which had once seemed so full of possibility, now felt like a dark, looming presence that threatened to swallow them whole. Once inside, Adam pulled the journal from his bag. He flipped through the pages, searching for any clue that might help them understand what was happening. The journal was filled with entries from Edward Hale, but the later pages were increasingly erratic. The writing was shaky, the words scribbled in a frenzy. "There's something about the land," Adam muttered, scanning the last few entries. Edward mentioned something about a pact. A ritual. Emily, who had been pacing nearby, stopped and turned to him. "What kind of ritual?" Adam's fingers hovered over the page. He could feel his pulse quicken as he read aloud the last entry. "The ritual must be completed, or the land will claim us. We made the pact, and now we must fulfill it. If we do not, the land will take back what it gave our souls." Emily's heart raced as she absorbed the words. A pact? What is that supposed to mean? What did they promise the land? "I don't know," Adam said, his voice thick with frustration. "But whatever it is, it's tied to us now. We can't just leave." Emily turned away, her mind reeling. "But we didn't make a pact. We didn't ask for any of this." "I think we've been part of it all along," Adam replied softly. I think the land chose us." The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and Emily felt the weight of it settle in her chest. She didn't want to believe it, but the strange events, the disappearances, the dreams, the woman's warning began to fall into place. It was as though the farm had been waiting for them, and now that they were here, there was no turning back. Suddenly, they heard a noise, footsteps outside the house, faint but distinct. Adam stood up, his senses on high alert. He glanced at Emily, who had frozen in place, her wide eyes locked on the door. They listened, the footsteps growing louder, closer. Then, the door creaked open, slowly, without anyone touching it. A chill ran down Adam's spine as the door swung wide, revealing nothing but the dark, empty yard outside. "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam didn't answer. He stepped cautiously toward the door, the floor creaking beneath his feet. He peered into the darkness but saw nothing. "It's her," he said quietly. "The woman. She's trying to lead us somewhere." He turned to Emily, who was standing behind him, her face pale. "We have to go," he said urgently. "We have to go now." They rushed out of the house, their hearts pounding as they moved toward the barn. The sky had darkened since they arrived, and the wind was picking up again, howling through the trees as though the land itself was trying to warn them. When they reached the barn, the doors were wide open. Adam's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of old hay and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. The barn was larger than they had thought, its vast interior stretching out before them. The floorboards creaked ominously underfoot as they moved deeper into the barn, the dim light from their flashlights casting eerie shadows against the walls. There was something in the corner, an altar, crude but unmistakable, made of stone and wood. Emily gasped as she looked at it. This was here before. Adam's gaze followed hers. The altar had been covered with a thick layer of dust, but now it was pristine, the stone smooth and shining in the dim light. In front of it were several objects, bones, old coins, and a small, intricately carved wooden box. He reached out to touch the box, his hand trembling. As his fingers brushed against it, the ground beneath them rumbled. A deep, vibrating hum filled the barn, shaking the walls. Suddenly, a voice, low, raspy, and ancient, whispered from the darkness. "You have returned." The barn seemed to come alive around them, the walls stretching, the air thickening. Adam and Emily turned toward the voice, but there was no one there. The voice spoke again, this time louder, more insistent. "The pact is incomplete. You must finish what was started, or you will never leave. The land has claimed you. It always claims what is its own." With a final, deafening crash, the doors to the barn slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. Adam and Emily were no longer alone in the barn. The shadows seemed to move, coiling around them, whispering in a language they couldn't understand. The land had chosen them, and now it was time to fulfill the pact, whether they were ready or not. And deep inside the earth, beneath the soil, something ancient stirred, waiting for the final offering. Adam and Emily stood frozen in the heart of the barn, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The voice, now louder, more tangible, seemed to wrap itself around them, growing in intensity with each passing second. "We have to stop it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "Whatever this is, we can't let it take us." Adam's mind raced. The journal, the altar, the warning, it all made sense now. The pact, the land, everything had been building toward this moment. There was no way out unless they confronted whatever force controlled this place. He turned to Emily, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We need to destroy the altar. It's the only way to break the pact." Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear but resolute. They approached the altar slowly, every step an effort, the air thick with the hum of energy. Adam reached out to touch the wooden box. As his fingers brushed it, the barn shook violently, and the whispers escalated into screams, voices from beyond the earth clawing at them. He hesitated, then opened the box. Inside was a small, ancient stone, dark, almost translucent material that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. The moment Adam touched it, the barn groaned, and the shadows around them thickened. The ground rumbled as if something deep within it was awakening. "Destroy it!" Emily screamed, backing away from the altar, her eyes darting around in panic. The barn felt alive now, as if it were closing in on them, intent on trapping them forever. Adam didn't hesitate. He threw the stone onto the ground with all his strength, his heart pounding in his chest. There was a deafening crack as the stone shattered, and for a brief moment, everything went still. The whispers stopped. The barn fell silent. Then, the ground beneath them trembled once more, but this time, the energy was different, lighter, as if the land itself had released its grip on them. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air seemed to clear. The barn, once a place of dread, felt empty. Adam and Emily stood there for a moment, their breath coming in shallow gasps. It was over. The force that had claimed the farm, that had twisted the land into something dark and unrecognizable, was gone. The pact had been broken. Without a word, they turned and exited the barn, the doors creaking open as if on their own accord. The moonlight bathed the land in a soft, ethereal glow, and for the first time since they'd arrived, the farm felt peaceful. The air smelled fresh, the distant rustling of the trees no longer ominous but comforting. They didn't speak as they walked back to the farmhouse, but the weight on their shoulders had lifted. They had faced something ancient, something beyond their understanding, and they had come through it. They had broken the pact. The next morning, when the sun rose over the farm, it felt like a new beginning. Adam and Emily knew the land had tried to claim them, but they had fought back, and they had won. In time, the farm became a place of peace, a sanctuary where they could live free from the shadows that had once haunted them. But they would never forget what they had faced, and they would never forget the woman's warning, "The land always remembers." But as the years passed, the farm grew silent again, and the whispers faded into the wind. The land had found its peace, and so had they. For now, at least.